Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. I hope you've all had a great week. If you are new here, please consider subscribing if you end up liking this video. So today we are going all the way back to 19th century France to talk about the French maid massacres. And I think that one of my subscribers requested this one a while back. So thank you to whoever requested this one. It is crazy and a truly creepy case. So back in 19th century France, most young women who were not born into wealth would often become live-in servants for noble families. They really didn't have many other options. And in the mid-1800s, there was a monster lurking around the city of Lyon, taking advantage of these young women, offering them high-paying jobs in big houses or castles, but most of these women were never seen again. And this man became known as the French maid killer, and he had one of the most messed up childhood experiences I've ever heard of. And it is thought that this experience kind of changed him and ultimately set him on the path to become a killer. Before we get started, I'm going to go ahead and apologize for my pronunciations of some of the French names in this video. I did look up the pronunciations, but sometimes those are not accurate, and I'm definitely going to be butchering some words in this one. And now let's just go ahead and jump in and find out more about the French maid killer. But first, I'd like to thank today's sponsor, Kitsch. Kitsch is a global accessory brand that offers tons of different products, from hair clips and satin pillowcases to heatless curlers and everything in between. Their solid shampoo and conditioner bars have become a really popular option, and they have lots of different types to choose from, including coconut oil, tea tree and mint, and rice water protein. And if you're not sure which one to get, the Kitsch website also has a short quiz that you can take to help you decide which shampoo and conditioner bars would be best suited for your hair. I've just recently tried these solid rice water protein shampoo and conditioner bars, and I absolutely love how my hair has responded to these. If you're not familiar with the benefits of rice water protein, it helps to repair and strengthen damaged hair, and it can also improve texture as well. I have not been kind to my hair over the years. I get highlights on a pretty regular basis, so I do struggle with some breakage. And because I live in an insanely humid climate, my little broken strands like to frizz up throughout the day. So I'm always on the hunt for new products to help me with this issue. And after using the rice water protein bars, I'm actually pretty impressed. My hair feels very soft and clean and moisturized. And I also feel like my flyaways and frizz look much more tamed. And that benefit alone is enough for me to call this a win. The shampoo and conditioner bars are free of phthalates, parabens, silicones, and sulfates, and they lather up really well. I also love this little caddy. I have it attached to my shower wall, and it holds all of my shampoo and conditioner bars. Kitsch also has these little beauty bar bags labeled shampoo and conditioner, so you can store your bars in the bags to keep them safe and clean and keep them from getting mixed up. And since there are no plastic bottles involved, you're not only helping your hair, but you're also helping the environment. I will definitely be trying out some other Kitsch products very soon. I think the next thing that I want to try is some of the solid body wash bars. There's a shea butter one that sounds really good. And if you want to try out Kitsch for yourself, you can click the link in my description box and use my code SUMMER for 25% off store-wide. Kitsch ships in the US and internationally to more than 27 countries, and they also offer a subscription option for even better discounts. Thanks again to Kitsch for sponsoring this video, and now let's jump into the case. On May 28, 1861, in Lyon, France, a young woman named Marie Pichon received some good news. While walking on the Guillotière Bridge that day, she was approached by a very nice man. The two struck up a conversation, and the man told her that he was currently employed as the head servant for a wealthy family in the town of Daneux. The man told her all about his employers and how kind and generous that they were, paying their servants 250 francs per year, which was apparently a pretty substantial amount for the time. And it just so happened that his employers had just recently put him in charge of recruiting young women to come live in their large country home and join their staff of servants. And he thought that she would be the perfect fit. Marie was not about to pass up this amazing opportunity, so she agreed to take the job and make the move from Lyon to Daneux. And luckily for her, the man even offered to escort her to her new employer's home and help carry all of her possessions on the way. So Marie packed up everything of value that she owned into a large chest, and the man carried it for her all the way to the train station. He was a large man and he looked strong, but he walked with a limp, which did slow him down a bit. And he also had a very distinctive face, a face that would be really hard for anyone to forget. He had piercing blue eyes, thick black hair, a black beard that wrapped around his chin, and he looked like he may have been born with either a cleft lip or cleft palate. He did look sort of intimidating, but his kind, calm demeanor put Marie at ease, and the two of them boarded a train headed for the town of Montluel. The train would take them very close to their destination, with only a short walk from the station to Marie's new employer's home. And while they were on the train, Marie and the man made conversation, and as each minute passed, she felt more and more comfortable with the man, and she was excited about starting her new life in a new town working for this amazing family. When the train finally arrived in Montluel, the man picked up the chest holding all of Marie's belongings, and the two exited the train and began the final leg of their journey on foot. In order to get to the house, the man said that they would have to walk off the main road and through the woods. The sun had started to set at this point, and it was starting to get dark, but Marie felt confident that the man would be able to protect her if anything happened, so they headed towards the dark, secluded woods. And then suddenly the man stopped, and he set down the chest and he bent down to tie his shoe. At least that's what Marie assumed he was doing. So Marie walked ahead a bit, just looking around at the dark forest, patiently waiting for the man to finish up tying his shoe, when suddenly he crept up behind her and tossed a lariat around her neck. A lariat is a rope or a cord that's tied like a lasso. The man started pulling the rope tighter and tighter as Marie was struggling to get away, but she wasn't choking like she should have been. He had thrown the lariat at the exact moment that Marie had lifted up her arm to rub her eye, so when he tossed the rope around her neck, he caught her arm too, which protected her neck. So all he was doing at this point was pinning her hand to her face. And once he realized his mistake, he loosened his grip on the rope, and since he had been pulling with so much force, when he let up, Marie just fell to the ground. And as soon as she was free, she started running as fast as she could through the woods, abandoning everything she owned in that chest, and she didn't look back. And she kept going until she came to a group of farmers at the Joly family farm in the commune of Bailyn. Marie explained everything that had just happened, and the farmers assured her that she was safe there for the night, and they would escort her back to Lyon in the morning. In the meantime, though, the farmers got together and they set out to Danube to report the incident to the authorities there. And after police heard Marie's entire story, they immediately knew that this must be the same man that they had been hearing about. The Danube police had heard stories about a man perfectly fitting this description who had been traveling around the area of Lyon, offering young women high-paying jobs as live-in servants, offering to escort them to their new home, then leading them into the woods and attacking them. This had been happening in various towns throughout this area of France over the past 6 years, and some of these women were never seen again. The body of one missing woman was discovered in a forest back in February of 1855. So the Danube police started questioning the locals, describing the man in detail, making sure to mention the cleft lip and the limp, which were two of the more standout traits. And it didn't take long before they had a name. There was a man in town living in a rundown home with his wife going by the name of Raymond Dumoulard, and he fit this description perfectly. So a warrant was issued, and on June 2nd, 1861, police went out to the Dumoulard home where Raymond and his wife Marie Anne were arrested. A large team of police were called out to search the property, and what they found was truly disturbing. First of all, the home was in pretty bad shape, and the inside was total chaos. There was just stacks of stuff everywhere. There was clothing, jewelry, heirlooms, just all spread out across the house. And as police started looking through the piles of stuff, they realized that what they were looking at were the stolen belongings from countless women, and some of the clothing was covered in blood. The amount of clothing and jewelry that they were looking at confirmed that this case was much bigger than anything they could have ever imagined, and this man had way more victims than they originally thought. The man's name was not Raymond Dumoulard. It was actually Martin Dumoulard, and he was born on June 22nd, 1810, to his parents Pierre and Marie Josette Ray. Martin's father, Pierre, had actually been born in Hungary, where he was born into a life of luxury. His name in Hungary was Pierre Dumoulin, and his family was considered nobility. But when the Austrian Empire was formed in 1804, the new emperor stripped Pierre's family and other noble families of their status. So in retaliation, Pierre and the others got together and formed a plan to assassinate the Austrian emperor. But the plan fell through, and the emperor found out about it. And so he sent his men out to hunt down the conspirators. Several of the men were caught, and they were publicly executed, but Pierre managed to escape. He had packed up whatever valuables and money that he could manage to carry, and he fled the country disguised as a peasant. And by the time Pierre made it to France, he was almost out of money. So he settled in a small commune called Salon-les-Thermes, farms, and he started working in the market. And he quickly became known as a good businessman, and he started managing the businesses of several of the local merchants. He changed his last name from Dumoulin to Dumoulard, which to me doesn't seem different enough for a man who is literally a fugitive of the Austrian Empire, but this was his new name and his new life. And before long, he met Marie Josette Ray, and the two of them fell in love and got married. 3 years after the birth of their first son, Martin, in 1810, they had another son named Raymond. And after the birth of Raymond, the family moved to Daneux into a larger home, and they settled into this little community. The residents of Daneux adored little Raymond, but Martin was a different story. By the age of 3, Martin had developed a reputation as a thief and a bully. He would steal things from the locals, and he would get into lots of fights with the other kids in town. And I'm trying to imagine a 3-year-old causing this much trouble, but apparently it got so bad that the townspeople decided that they were going to call a meeting with Pierre and Marie Josette about Martin's behavior. But before they could call this meeting, little Raymond got very sick, and unfortunately he did not recover. The family and the town were all devastated, and the locals really came together to support the Dumoulard family. Martin was only 3 years old at the time, so he had a hard time understanding what had even happened to his baby brother, and after this his demeanor really shifted. He became really sad and more isolated, and he didn't cause as much trouble as he had before. But if he ever did revert back to his old ways, the townspeople would taunt him by calling him Raymond. They knew that if they called him by his dead brother's name, that he would immediately fall silent and he would get really sad. So they used that to their advantage as a way to control Martin's behavior. And every time this happened, Martin grieved all over again, and he became even more withdrawn. And if this wasn't bad enough, just 1 year after Raymond's death, the family was hit with another tragedy. And just a warning, this does get pretty brutal. So at this point, Napoleon Bonaparte was the emperor of France, and he really wanted to see the Italian states unified. If unification happened, it would give France a powerful ally. But the Austrian Empire did not want this to happen. So in an effort to keep the French army from gathering their troops and sending them off to aid the cause, Austrian troops were sent to France. And this was not good news for Pierre. He was still wanted by the Austrian Empire for his role in the assassination plot. So when word of all of this makes its way to the town of Daneux, Pierre panics. So he packs up whatever valuables he could, and he and Marie Josette and their 4-year-old son Martin load up into a wagon and head for the city-state of Padua in Italy. Pierre knew that Padua opposed the Austrian Empire, and he thought that he and his family would be safe there, but the hard part was making it there without being noticed. And the family did make it. But as their wagon slowly approached the city gates leading into Padua, they realized that they were too late. The Austrians were already there, and their troops were posted at the gates. But Pierre couldn't just turn around because that would be super suspicious, so he had no choice but to just keep calm and guide the wagon through the gates and past the Austrian troops. And that's exactly what he did. And just when Pierre thought that he was in the clear, one of the Austrian soldiers recognized him. Since Pierre had been from a noble family back in Hungary, there had been paintings of him done years earlier. So one of the Austrians recognized him from an old painting, and he and his family were immediately arrested. So once Marie and Martin were questioned, it was obvious that they hadn't taken part in the assassination attempt, and they didn't know anything about it, so they were both released. But Pierre was kept in custody while word was sent for someone who had actually known Pierre back in Hungary to come to Padua and confirm his identity. And about a month after he was arrested, one of Pierre's old servants arrived to confirm that he was in fact Pierre de Moulin, the man that they had been looking for. So while all of this is happening, Martin and Marie are just roaming around Padua with no money, and they can't speak the language, so they have no clue what's going on. They're basically just begging in the streets every day and hoping that Pierre will be released. But of course, Pierre would not be released. He was actually going to be publicly executed. Pierre was dragged out into the town square in front of everyone in Padua, including lots of Austrian soldiers and his wife and son, and he was prepped for execution. So by this point, public executions still happened, but they weren't super common, and when they did happen, they were really quick. It would be by hanging or guillotine. But what they did to Pierre was even more barbaric. Since being a traitor was like the worst offense you could commit, Pierre's punishment was dismemberment. They tied a rope around each of his limbs, and then they tied the other ends to 4 horses. Then they fired a shot into the air to startle the horses so they would run and ultimately pull Pierre's arms and legs off. But this was not even the worst part. Because the town square wasn't very spacious and the horses that they were using weren't able to run at full speed, instead of ripping Pierre's limbs off, it had actually just caused his shoulder and hip joints to pop out of place. So Pierre was just screaming in excruciating pain, but the worst was yet to come. Once they realized that the horses had done as much damage as they were going to be able to do, the executioner asked the crowd if anyone had an axe. Someone in the crowd did have an axe, but it was a wood-cutting axe, and the blade was extremely dull. But this was all they had, so the executioner used that axe to cut off each of Pierre's arms and legs while he was still alive. As I mentioned, Marie and Martin are present in the town square while all of this is happening, but their view was being mostly blocked by all of the other people watching. And since they can't speak the language, they can't understand what anyone is saying. So at this point, they don't fully understand what's happening. So Marie has the brilliant idea to lift her 4-year-old up in the air to see what's going on. And she lifted him up just in time for him to witness his father's limbs being hacked off. And at one point, the executioner even ripped off what was left of his father's leg. And the entire time this is happening, the crowd full of Austrians were just cheering and laughing. Does that not sound like some Game of Thrones shit? And once Pierre was finally dead and the crowd was gone, Marie finally saw for herself what was left of her husband, and she was horrified. She just laid on the ground and screamed. She and Martin eventually left and headed back to France, but it was a very hard journey. Marie had pretty much shut down completely, and she was so overcome with grief that she couldn't even take care of herself. So Martin had to take care of her. He would go out and hunt small animals for Marie to cook, but she wouldn't eat unless he literally forced food into her mouth. They finally did make it back to France, but they were chased out of Danube once the locals found out that the Pierre that they had all known and loved had actually been a traitor. So with nowhere else to turn, Marie and Martin went to Salon-les-Thermes, where Marie's family lived. Marie was unable to work at this point. She was so messed up from what happened to Pierre, she would even go catatonic at times. And all the while, poor Martin had to deal with his own grief all alone, and he had actually witnessed the execution. So Martin became known in the area as a feral child. He would run around outside all the time by himself. He would sleep outside. He would hunt small animals, and some people say that they even saw Martin eating rabbits raw. And by the time Martin was 8 years old, he was pretty much living totally separate from his mother and her family. He ended up getting a job as a shepherd for some wealthy farmers in the area. He would sleep outside and watch over the sheep and protect them from any predators, and he actually loved this job. But one day while he was at work, he climbed on top of a hayloft and he fell, and this messed him up for the rest of his life. He was unable to walk for days after that fall, and when he finally was able to walk again, it caused him so much pain to stand up straight that he started walking hunched over, which explains that limp that his victims described. And this ended his employment as a shepherd. The farmers didn't want to take a chance on Martin getting hurt again, especially now that he couldn't get around as easily, so they let him go. And around this time, lots of food and valuables started coming up missing around the area. Martin started stealing from the townspeople and then selling their stuff in order to survive. And the problem got so bad that the authorities got involved, so Martin left town in search of a new job. And he ended up being hired as a servant in a castle in the town of Saint Andre de Courcy. He was hired to tend to the animals, which is what he really wanted to do anyway. He wanted to be outside and he wanted to be alone. The owner of the castle was a man named Guichard, and he paid his employees well and he was very kind. So Martin was happy to spend the rest of his life working in this castle, tending to animals once again. But then he caught the eye of a young maid who was also working in the castle. Her name was Marie Anne Martinet, and she and Martin started seeing each other and became sort of an item. And Marie Anne really helped to fill an emotional void that Martin had had ever since he was 4 years old, and they became very close. And it got to the point where she would even start talking for Martin. He was still very, very quiet, extremely introverted, so Marie Anne would basically speak for him, and she also told him what to do most of the time. But Martin didn't seem to mind being bossed around. I think he was just happy to have someone who cared for him, and they continued on like this for 10 years. They worked together in this castle and spent any free time they could together. But after about a decade of this, Marie Anne decided that she wanted more than what the castle had to offer. So she started pushing Martin to propose to her, but Martin knew that if they got married, Marie Anne would want to leave the castle to start a new life, and Martin didn't want to do that. He was scared of that thought. He knew exactly what it was like being out there on his own trying to survive, and he didn't want to do that again. But Marie Anne was not letting up. At this point, they hadn't gone all the way yet. They had only kissed and cuddled, basically. So she started showing a little more skin and kissing him a little more suggestively as a way to kind of nudge him towards marriage, and this totally worked. They ended up getting married right there on the castle estate, and their employer, Guichard, was so happy for them. He actually cried at the ceremony because he looked at them as his children, and Guichard really wanted to help them get started in their new life outside of the castle. So he actually gave them some extra money to help them start their new life. And even after he gave them this extra money, before they left the castle, they stole some silverware. And this actually broke Guichard's heart because he looked at them as family. So he didn't report this to police or anything. He just figured that they must need it more than he did. So Martin and Marie Anne took their savings along with the extra money that they had received from Guichard, and they bought a house in the town of Le Montellier. And they spent the next week living large in their new home, going through most of their savings on this makeshift honeymoon. But once that week was up, Martin had to go out and find a job. But the only thing Martin knew how to do was tend to animals, and he knew that if he was going to do that type of job now, he was going to be gone from Marie for really long stretches of time, and he didn't want to do that. So his options were pretty slim. And eventually things got so bad that they had to sell off their clothes and valuables just to make it. And when the money was completely gone and they had nothing left to sell, they finally had to sell their home in Le Montellier and move to Danube, where Martin had spent the first years of his life with his mother and father and his brother Raymond. And this house was not nearly as luxurious as their house in Le Montellier. This was a very rundown old house that they were living in. And once they settled in Danube, Martin did some odd jobs around the town, helping farmers with different chores here and there, but he couldn't really find anything substantial. They were basically living in poverty. And Marie Anne did not help the situation at all. She put a lot of pressure on Martin to find a job, but not just any job. Marie Anne wanted to be pampered and treated to the finer things in life, and she wanted to live comfortably. And she was not shy about voicing this to Martin and punishing him if he didn't give her what she wanted. She would intentionally withhold sex and emotional support from Martin as punishment when he wasn't providing enough for her. So Martin was desperate to figure out how to keep his wife happy. He was so afraid of losing the one and only person that he had in the entire world. And so Martin decided that robbing and killing was the only answer to his problem. And this is where he began his life as a killer. So one day he told Marie Anne that he was going to walk to the town of Lyon and search for work. And he did walk to Lyon, but not to find work. Instead, he hid near the road and waited for people to pass by so that he could rob them. But this did not go well. He actually got laughed at by a group of men in a carriage when he demanded money from them. Then another man came by, this time on foot, and when Martin tried to rob him, the man used his walking stick to beat the shit out of him. So after a bunch of mostly failed attempts, Martin decided to try a different spot. He was worried that police would eventually show up if he kept attacking people in the same area, so he walked to the commune of Montluel and hid near the road, and eventually a young woman passed by and she was all alone. Martin jumped out and just started relentlessly beating her, and once she was down on the ground, he stripped off all of her clothes, even her underwear. Then he dragged her body into the woods and he fled. He didn't know if she was dead or just unconscious, but he didn't care. He headed back to Danube, selling the girl's clothes along the way, and he got a decent payout from these clothes. He ran straight home to show Marie Anne all the money that he had made that day, and she was very pleased. All of her affection returned, and she was nice and attentive towards Martin again, which made Martin very happy. But then Marie Anne asked Martin how he had made all of that money. Martin did not even try to make up a lie. He immediately confessed everything, the attack on the woman and all of the failed attempts to rob the people on the road. And Martin fully expected Marie Anne to be super disappointed and maybe even leave him, but that's not what happened. She was totally fine with her husband attacking women. As long as he kept bringing home this kind of money, she was completely cool with it. But she did have some constructive criticism. She told Martin that he had been too reckless by letting people escape after seeing his face. Like that woman that he attacked, Martin left without knowing if she was dead or alive, but if she was alive, she could easily go report Martin to the police. So he was going to have to kill his victims. And Marie Anne also thought that they needed to come up with a solid plan to lure young women to him instead of just waiting for them to walk by chance. So they stayed up all night coming up with a plan and essentially writing a script for Martin to memorize. Martin would pretend to be a servant for a wealthy family. He would go into towns approaching young women, asking them to come work for his employer, making lots of promises of high salaries, beautiful living accommodations. He would even offer to carry their luggage for them and guide them to their new home. Then, once he had them all alone in a secluded area, he would kill them and steal all of their belongings. And this was exactly what Martin did for at least 6 years, but probably much longer based on the amount of clothing and valuables that were found in the Dumoulard home. Throughout the course of those 6 years, police received several reports from young women narrowly escaping death and giving identical descriptions of their attacker. There were about 15 known victims, and the ones who made it out alive would all tell a very similar story. So the first known victim that Martin targeted using this new tactic was a woman named Marie Bedet in February of 1855. Marie Bedet was living in Lyon, and she wasn't very close with her family, so she was mostly on her own. And she had just lost her job, and she was struggling a lot financially, and this all made her the perfect target. Marie Bedet was actually getting ready to be thrown out of her apartment because she couldn't pay her rent. In fact, the day that she went missing, she had a huge argument with her landlady, Madeleine Ascendon, and right before Marie Bedet left, she told Madeleine that she wouldn't be returning because she had received a better offer and she was leaving Lyon for good. Madeleine watched her pack her clothes in a trunk, and a man was waiting for her outside, and the two of them started walking in the direction of the city gates. And of course, this man was Martin, and he had offered Marie Bedet a job, and she accepted because she was so desperate for work. Marie's nude body was found a couple of weeks later by some hunters in the forest of Montavernay near Tremois. She had been badly beaten and subjected to what they called gross outrage, which meant that she had been raped. They also found bloody clothing scattered all around her body, so they assumed that whoever had done this was sexually motivated, but that was not the case. Martin had been away from his wife for several days when he picked up Marie Bedet. He escorted Marie into the woods that night, waited for the right moment, crept up behind her, and hit her in the back of her head, knocking her unconscious. And it wasn't until he had stripped her clothes off so he could sell them that he decided to sexually assault her. Once he was done, he continued beating her until he was sure that she was dead. And in the process, the clothes that she had been wearing got soaked in blood, so he just left them behind. The body was transported to the city of Tremois to be identified, but no one in town knew who she was because she wasn't from there. So they hired a photographer to come and take photos of Marie Bedet's body. And to do this, they posed her nude body in the courtyard of a local church and took the photos. Then they posted the photos and handed them out to officers, trying desperately to identify this girl. I, of course, am not going to include that in this video because it's very disturbing, but you can easily find that photo online. And it took several months before someone identified the body, but the person who had come forward actually mistook her for another missing girl, a girl named Marceline Ganelli, who had gone missing around the same time as Marie Bedet. So this is who they thought she was. But eventually that photo made its way to Lyon, and Marie Bedet's mother recognized the girl as her daughter. Her identity was confirmed when she was able to describe some of the clothing that was found at the crime scene. 2 different men were arrested over the following months. One of these men was Marie Bedet's boyfriend. His last name was Verger, but he was eventually released because he was able to prove that he wasn't anywhere near the area at the time. Then another man named Martin Marriott, who was a convicted rapist, was also arrested, but it was discovered that he was actually in prison when Marie disappeared, so it couldn't have been him either. So now they were back to square one, and Martin's second known victim was taken right after Marie Bedet's body was discovered. Her name was Olympe Alibert, and she was actually not his original intended victim. Martin had made arrangements weeks earlier to travel to Lyon to pick up a woman named Marie Carte. So when Martin arrived in Lyon to pick up Marie Carte, she told him that she had changed her mind because she had just recently started dating someone and she didn't want to leave him. But she felt really bad for having Martin come all the way to Lyon to come get her, so she told him that she had a friend, Olympe Alibert, who was working as a servant, but she was making much less than the amount that Martin was offering. So Martin agreed to take Olympe instead, and they set out on the road together. But pretty much from the start, Olympe started to get a little nervous. Martin was guiding her through the same forest where they had just discovered Marie Bedet's body. But Martin managed to keep her talking and calm while they were walking. He asked her questions about her life back home. You know, what was her life like before this? Is she close to her family? Does she have a secret stash of money hidden anywhere in the trunk that he was carrying? This last question felt weird to Olympe, but she answered anyway. But Martin kept bringing it back up. He kept circling right back to this question. And now it was starting to get dark outside and they were getting ready to enter the forest. And at this point, everything in Olympe is telling her that something isn't right. So she stopped walking and she said that she was not comfortable going into the woods and they needed to find a place to sleep for the night. But Martin just kept insisting that they keep walking because the house was just beyond the forest. But this is where he messed up. He had told Olympe earlier that the house was a couple of hours from the forest, but now he's insisting that it was just beyond the forest. So now she knew he was lying. And in that moment, Olympe turned around and took off running as fast as she could. Martin picked up a large rock and threw it and hit her directly in the back, knocking the wind out of her, almost causing her to fall, but she managed to stay on her feet and keep running. He chased after her for a while, but he eventually gave up, so Olympe actually escaped, and she would be the first victim to give police a description of the killer. She saw a small farming community in the distance, so she ran there for help. The farmers took her in and they stayed up all night with weapons just waiting for the man to show up, but he never did. The next day, the farmers escorted Olympe back to Lyon and straight to the authorities to file a report, and she gave them a description of the attacker. He was a large man in his 50s, dark hair, dark beard, walked with a limp, and had a lump or a scar on his lip. In September of 1855, a young maid named Josette Charlotte was walking through the market in Lyon when she was approached by a man offering her a high-paying job as a maid. Josette accepted the job and asked the man to return on September 22nd to give her a little bit of time to pack up and get her affairs in order. So Martin returned on the 22nd and the two of them set out towards the area of Cotier. This is where he said the job would be. And once again, Martin offered to carry her belongings for her. They had pretty good lighthearted conversation all throughout the day, but he would randomly ask her if she had any money hidden, which started to set off alarm bells. As time went on, Josette was starting to get a little more weirded out by Martin, but instead of letting on that she was suspicious, she tried to test him by mentioning the murder of Marie Bedet, just to see if she would get a reaction. But he didn't flinch. He was totally unfazed. But Josette still knew that something was off, so she told him that she was going to stop and find a farmhouse to sleep for the night. And it was not a question like with his last victim. She was like, "This is what I'm doing. You can either come with me or I can meet you back here in the morning." And Martin actually did let her go. Since he had all of her possessions still with him, he thought that she would actually come back the next morning, but he was wrong. And Josette was now the second woman to come forward to report a big scary man in his 50s, fitting the exact same description that Olympe had given the police. And this second failure did not deter Martin one bit, because the very next month, in October 1855, he was right back in Lyon searching for his next victim. And there he found a woman named Jeanne Marie walking through the city looking for work. And using the same MO as before, he offered her a high-paying job. She accepted, and then the two set out together the next day on Halloween. Martin carried her traveling trunk full of her possessions, and they started walking in the direction of the woods on the same path he had led the others. Except this time, his victim started feeling uncomfortable almost immediately. Jeanne Marie said that she could feel the little hairs on the back of her neck stand up, and she couldn't pinpoint what it was, but she knew that she needed to get away from this man. So before they even got close to the woods, she bolted. No warning or attempts to get her belongings, she just started running. She started running towards a church that she saw in the distance, and she found a group of farmers and told them the entire story. And they instantly knew that she was describing the mysterious man who had been attacking women in the area. They actually went out hunting for Martin, but they couldn't find him anywhere. So the next morning, a big group of farmers escorted Jean-Marie back to Lyon to file a report. And again, police are hearing the same description. This is obviously the same man who had attacked the others, but they didn't really do much to pursue him. So the investigation essentially went nowhere. By November 1855, Martin was back at it in Lyon, and this time he met the overly trusting 22-year-old Victorine Pichon. Victorine wasn't from the area. She had only traveled to Lyon to find work, making her the perfect victim. She accepted Martin's offer for work. He grabbed her traveling trunk with her money and clothing inside, and they set off on the same path that he had led the others. Unlike the others, though, Victorine never got a bad feeling from Martin. She was completely trusting and followed him without question. At one point, they kind of stopped in a city and there was a big crowd of people, and Victorine lost sight of Martin. She ran all over trying to find him, yelling out to him. For whatever reason, Martin had decided to just take that opportunity to steal her stuff and let her live. Maybe he found her trusting nature charming and he couldn't bring himself to kill her. I don't know, but Victorine walked angrily back to Lyon to file a report for her stolen property. They listen to Victorine's story and they start writing out a police report, and when she starts describing what the man looked like, it was like the record stopped. They all knew based on her description that this was the killer that they had been hunting for months, and that Victorine didn't understand how lucky she had been that day. She had narrowly escaped death. Then sometime in the late 1850s, a woman named Julie Farguet was let go from her live-in maid position, and she was on the hunt for a new job. Julie had been fired because she and her employer had started having an affair and she got pregnant with his child. So in an attempt to just wash his hands of the problem, the man gave Julie some extra cash as hush money, and then he fired her, not only taking away her income, but also her living accommodations. And once other wealthy families found out that Julie was pregnant, she was deemed unhireable. This reminds me a lot of the Victorian baby farming video that I did. So now Julie is homeless and jobless and pregnant. So when she met Martin Dumoulard in Lyon one day and he offered her a high-paying job as a maid in beautiful living accommodations, she had no choice but to say yes. At this point, Julie wasn't really showing, so she assumed that Martin didn't know that she was pregnant or he would never have offered her this job. So the two set out for Julie's new home, and she decided that she really needed to tell Martin that she was pregnant. She figured everyone was going to find out anyways once she started showing, so she might as well come clean. So she pulls Martin aside and she tells him that she's in a family way, and the father had been a soldier, but he had died in battle. And to her surprise, Martin didn't even care that she was pregnant. So the two just kept walking, and once he had her all alone in a secluded area, Martin lunged at her, trying to rip her clothes off. Julie screamed really loud in Martin's face, which seemed to freak him out, and he jumped back. So Julie turned to run, but Martin managed to grab her apron, which had all of her money inside, and he ripped it off of her and ran away. Some farmers came running over to Julie to help her when they heard her screams, but Martin was gone. Martin had told Julie that he was from Saint Andre de Courcy, so the next day, the farmers walked there with Julie so she could file a report with the authorities. But once she told them her story, the authorities didn't believe her. They took one look at her, realized that she didn't come from money, and assumed that she had to be lying about all the cash that she claimed to have in her apron. So they threw her in jail for vagrancy. What the actual hell? This really drives home the fact that these women were not considered important. If Martin's victims had been upper-class families, there would have been much more urgency in the investigation. Several women had come forward with the same description and the same story, and nothing is being done. In fact, the magistrate in Lyon thought that this was all something that peasants were making up, creating a story about a swollen-lipped ogre to make it sound like there was some boogeyman lurking in the woods. And the investigation didn't really seem that urgent because all of these women had made it out alive. Marie Bidet was the only one who had been murdered so far, or so they thought. Most of the victims that we just discussed had managed to escape, but there were some that were not so lucky. And it wasn't until Martin and Marie Anne's arrest that police learned that more women had been murdered. So once they were in custody, they were separated and questioned. Martin basically just shut down completely. He refused to speak, but Marie Anne started talking, and she was throwing all of the blame on her husband. Marie Anne hadn't actually killed anyone with her own hands that we know of, but she had orchestrated the entire plan to to lure the girls in. She washed the bloodstains out of the clothing. She even wore some of the clothing of the dead women. And she also sold them, so she was not innocent. But she wasn't admitting to anything in the beginning. Once police found all of those piles of clothing and jewelry and heirlooms in the Dumoulin home, they sent word to neighboring towns and communes that they had just arrested a couple in connection with some missing women, and if anyone had a missing loved one, that they should head over to Daigneau to the Dumoulin home to search through the clothing and see if it belonged to anyone they knew. And this is when a woman named Marie Josette showed up with a story about her missing sister, Marie Eulalie Busseau. She had seen her sister leave with a man who had promised her a high-paying job as a maid, and she hadn't been heard from since. Marie Josette had actually seen this man, and he fit the physical description of Martin Dumoulin. And sure enough, Marie Josette found several items belonging to her sister inside the Dumoulin home. Police took Marie Josette down to the jailhouse to identify Martin as the man that she had seen that day, and she recognized him immediately. So after several failed attempts at finding Marie Eulalie's body in the forest, police decide that they're going to take Martin by carriage into the woods just to see how he would react. And as he stood at the edge of the forest, he said, quote, "I know where the body is, and I'm ready to take you there." Martin led them to the spot where he had buried Marie Eulalie, and they found her shallow grave. Martin had lured her to the forest just like the others, but she hadn't been lucky enough to escape. Martin beat her until she was near death, then he sexually assaulted her, dug a hole, and then threw her in. She was actually still breathing when he threw her in the hole and started covering it up with dirt, so she was buried alive. Up until this point, police said that they viewed Martin as sort of a simpleton who just killed to make money, but after finding this body, they were now starting to look at him as a monster. So the final murder that we know of wasn't discovered until Marie Anne realized that she could use the knowledge of Martin's crimes to her advantage. The police told Marie Anne that she would be spared the guillotine if she helped them out. So she told police that in 1857, Martin killed a young girl in the Montmain woods and came home with the girl's clothes and valuables, which included some gold earrings. And she told police that she could lead them to the exact location where the girl was buried. And of course, this was proof that Marie Anne was much more involved than she was letting on. But the police just ignored that because they really needed her to testify against Martin. The body of the unknown young girl was unearthed, and it was so badly decomposed that they couldn't really tell the cause of death. But it is thought that Martin did sexually assault the woman multiple times before and after killing her, but this was never proven. Martin adamantly denied committing that murder though. He said he had no clue who this woman was or how she got there. There were 648 cases of missing women in the area during the time that Martin was known to be active, but in the end only 3 bodies were uncovered and connected to Martin. But police fully believed that if Martin would have been completely honest with them and come clean about everything, they would have been able to close most of those cases. And during questioning, Martin tried to blame the bulk of the crimes on 2 mysterious men that he referred to as his employers. He said that these 2 men had approached him about tricking young women into following him, and then they would take care of the rest. And while he was telling them this obviously made-up story, he mentioned 2 women who had been murdered by his employers and thrown into the river. Even though no remains were found in the river, it is believed that Martin had just accidentally confessed to 2 more murders. And after questioning Marie Anne more and more, she kept accidentally letting her knowledge of other murders slip. And by the end of all the questioning, police had reason to believe that at least 18 women had been murdered, which made much more sense when you looked at the absurd amount of stolen valuables in their home. And speaking of what was found in the home, apparently among all of the women's clothing, there were a couple of full outfits belonging to a boy around age 8 and another boy around age 10, based on the sizes. The police said that they couldn't even bring themselves to ask Martin or Marie Anne about these clothes because the thought of them killing a kid was just too much to handle. They did say that the clothing wasn't ripped or bloody, so they took that as a good sign that this was just there by chance. The trial began on January 29th, 1862, and it was absolute chaos. Word had spread all across France and beyond its borders, so there were people arriving in droves to watch the trial and get a glimpse of the monster. And the media was all over it. It was actually because of the media that we know as much as we know about this case today. It was reported that close to 5,000 people filled the courtroom and spilled out into the streets. Martin continued his story about the 2 men men and how they had put him up to everything. In the end, Martin was found guilty and met the same fate his father did, just not as gruesome. He was executed by guillotine on March 8, 1862 at the age of 51. And Marie Anne was given 20 years of hard labor and she died in prison. After he was executed, Martin's head was sent off to be examined at the Lyon Medical School. They wanted to examine his brain in hopes of finding some sort of abnormality to explain why he had turned into a monster. But his brain was totally normal, which told them that Martin's upbringing likely had a lot to do with how he turned out. And when Martin was still alive, he would tell people that the lump on his lip was caused from being bitten by a fly. But it was discovered during the examination of his brain that the lump on his lip was actually a benign tumor. And that was the case of the French Maid massacres. Let me know what you guys think about this one down in the comments. Also, I will be uploading on either Thursdays or Fridays temporarily. That equipment issue that I had a couple of weeks ago caused some serious delays and I'm still trying to recover, but I'm hoping to get back on track next month. If you found this video interesting, please consider subscribing and following me on Instagram at summer_SanchezYT. And as always, I appreciate each and every one of you for watching, and I will see you next time.